Hi. So we're ready to begin week two. You might be asking, why are we looking at Luke Acts? I think I mentioned that, the books of Luke and Acts, the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts in the New Testament, would form kind of the hub around which we talk about the Bible as it relates to spirituality, theology, certainly biblical studies, and that melded together with nursing. So why Luke Acts? Well, there's actually a really practical reason, and again, it's just the hub. We're not going to go in a deep dive into Luke Acts. It's because it mirrors what all APU students do. All APU students take a course in these two books written by the same individual, the gospel writer Luke, who also writes the book of Acts. And why we're focusing on something from the New Testament when there's so much in the Bible that we could look at is because if people are familiar with anything in the Bible, it tends to be something from the New Testament, it tends to be something from the Gospel. And so it seemed to make sense. Again, now we're going to go into other things, do other analysis of the text, but that's something that we can kind of get our minds around. And this gospel account of what Jesus did and said, and then what his disciples do after he dies, rises again, ascends to heaven, it's foundational for the rest of Christianity. So that makes sense as well, I think. When someone like me approaches text like this, what I want to do is I want to think theologically about the text. And if we talk about this discipline of theology, there are several components. One, biblical studies. So that's my area. Scripture is my area. I spent more time on the Old Testament than the New Testament academically, but Scripture is my area. Historical theology, or church history, that is, what has happened through the centuries since the church was founded in the first century. Systematics kind of gets at that reason piece. Now, you might be familiar with, and I know that some of your other professors are talking about the Wesleyan quadrilateral, four pieces, quad. So, biblical studies, scripture, church history, tradition. Systematic theology is reason. Very often, systematic theology and philosophy go hand in hand as some of the same kinds of ways of thinking about problems, ideas are mirrored with each other in systematics and in philosophy. And then practical theology is the walking of that out in church and in life or in other faith communities, right? So practical theology might be that experience piece. And there we have this kind of Wesleyan quadrilateral. So when I think about the scripture as not only a biblical studies academic, I also think about it as a person of the church. So I'm thinking about how's the church thought about this passage or passages throughout its history. I think about how have individuals who are concerned with big global kind of ideas, how have they weaved this text and that text together into a systematic understanding, and then how does that get walked out in the life of faith communities. So let me talk a little bit more, having laid that kind of background, a little bit more about my own discipline, biblical studies. Biblical studies tends to be text driven. That is, we look at a specific text and we analyze that text with respect to history, with respect to grammar, with respect to literature. We have all these different lenses that we kind of apply to the text. And then there are folks who are doing some other really creative things with the text, in that they're coming at the text from looking at the biblical text through a particular lens that is rooted in their own kind of experience, a kind of reader responding to the text. approach. That's an oversimplification, but that's something that's being done, and I need those. So I need women's eyes on the text. I need African American eyes on the text. I need Hispanic eyes on the text, and the list goes on, right? I need the eyes of people who are unlike me. Why? Why do I need that? I need that because it makes my understanding of my own rootedness and my own experience different. I can avoid then some of the myopia. I think sometimes about horses running in races, right? And they put the blinders on like this. Well, we all have a kind of blinder that just kind of naturally we operate with. We we see the world as we see the world, based on our experiences, based on our family, based on our gender, based on our ethnicity, based on our socioeconomic status. All of those kinds of things contribute to how we view the biblical text. And those are what we bring to the text unintentionally. Very often we talk about these as presuppositions. They are presupposed onto the text. I need other eyes on the text so that I can avoid some of the mistakes that I might make if I don't expand or remove my blinders. So in this class, we'll be trying to tease out some of the ethical implications of even looking at the text that way. We're going to be trying to tease out something with regard to spirituality. You all have an incredibly important part to play in my own development as we go through the reflections we're going to be asking you to do, as we go through the threaded discussions or the forums. You have a perspective that I don't have based on your experience, your profession, any number of other things. That will help me expand my view of what the text says. And so there are some that respond to that and say, well, the text just says what it says. The Bible means what the Bible means. That's when you actually get down to it, that's kind of difficult to maintain, because all text, even the biblical text, is interpreted. This is why we have battles about the Constitution in the United States, right? Why we have court battles over interpreting the Constitution. Because the text says what the text says, but how do we as readers, how do we interpret that text? All texts are interpreted. And if we think we can get away from the interpreted step or the interpretive step, we're going to be kind of mistaken. It just raises its head over and over again. So that's some of the background kind of philosophy, how we do some of this in my world. What the kinds of things that we're paying attention to. We're paying attention to history and grammar and literature, absolutely. But we're also paying attention to who we are as individuals and what we bring to the text, and whether that's of benefit or whether in some ways it's a hindrance. Okay? So we'll come back and we'll begin talking about a little thing called the historical critical approach. Prepare to be fascinated.